The forests were silent, too silent. In the dying years of the American Civil War, rumors spread through the backwoods like a disease, whispers of a man who could kill without being seen. No campfire was safe, no patrol ever felt alone. Men vanished from the trail with no warning, no sound, no trace. When slave hunters were sent to track down what they believed was an escaped man with a bounty on his head, they expected fear, weakness, a desperate fugitive. What they found instead was something far worse: a ghost, a rifle, and a war that hunted them back. This is the true story of the man history almost erased, the ghost sniper of the Civil War. Before we go deeper, subscribe if you want more dark, untold history told like a documentary, not a textbook. Turn on notifications so you don't miss what history tried to bury. And let me know in the comments, where are you watching from? In the decades leading into the Civil War, the American countryside became a marketplace where human lives were priced, traded, and hunted with bureaucratic efficiency. Laws like the Fugitive Slave Act transformed ordinary roads, river crossings, and forest trails into danger zones where any black person could be stopped, questioned, seized, and sold into captivity. The law rewarded capture, not truth, and it empowered private citizens to act as enforcers. This created a roaming class of men whose livelihoods depended on pursuit, suspicion, and violence, turning the landscape itself into an extension of the slave system. These slave hunters were not uniformed soldiers or trained lawmen. Many were former trappers, failed farmers, discharged soldiers, or men fleeing their own debts and crimes. What united them was the promise of quick money and legal protection for brutality. They carried shackles, pistols, dogs, and forged documents, knowing that few courts would challenge their word. In towns sympathetic to slavery, they were welcomed. In border regions, they operated in secrecy, moving at night, bribing locals, and using fear as a tool to isolate their targets from any possible aid. Bounties varied by region and by perceived value of the person being hunted. Younger, stronger individuals fetched higher prices, while repeat escapees were labeled dangerous and worth even more. Notices were posted in taverns, newspapers, and courthouse walls describing scars, accents, and family connections. These descriptions often exaggerated criminality, painting escape as theft and resistance as savagery. The bounty system encouraged speed over accuracy, which meant that free black citizens were frequently kidnapped simply because someone needed to deliver a body before a rival hunter did. Violence was not an accident of the system, but an expectation. Slave hunters were told resistance was likely and that force was justified preemptively. Guns were drawn before questions were asked. Dogs were unleashed to terrorize entire communities. Families were separated in the confusion of raids, and those left behind rarely knew where their loved ones had been taken. The hunters understood that fear spread faster than truth, and a reputation for cruelty made future captures easier as people learned to hide rather than seek help. The terrain itself shaped how these hunts unfolded. Dense forests, swamps, and mountain passes became contested spaces where knowledge of the land meant survival. Hunters relied on informants, often coercing poor whites or threatening free black residents into giving up information. In response, escape networks formed quietly, using churches, barns, and natural landmarks as waypoints. Every path became a gamble, every sound a possible signal. The hunt was rarely a single chase, but a drawn-out campaign of pressure and attrition. By the time the Civil War began, this system had hardened men into instruments of pursuit. The line between legal authority and predation blurred beyond recognition. Some slave hunters were absorbed into militias or Confederate units, bringing their methods with them. Others continued independently, exploiting the chaos of war to expand their reach. The conflict did not end the hunts immediately. Instead, it scattered them, making the countryside even more dangerous for those trying to move unseen. It was within this violent economy that certain individuals became marked not just as property, but as prizes. A person who resisted, escaped repeatedly, or disrupted the system threatened the income and authority of the hunters themselves. Such targets were no longer seen as men but as challenges, and when a bounty was placed on someone like that, it drew the most ruthless trackers, men who believed the law was on their side and the forest belonged to them, moving deeper into territory where confidence could dissolve into something else. Very little about the man at the center of the bounty survives in official records, and what does exist is fragmented, filtered through the voices of those who hunted him rather than those who knew him. Census entries vanish, Military rolls list initials without context, and court documents refer to him only as property or a suspect. This absence was not accidental, but systemic, a consequence of a society that documented ownership more carefully than humanity, leaving behind gaps where a life should have been clearly recorded. Before he became a target, he had already lived several lives shaped by conflict and movement. Born into bondage or forced labor, he learned early how to observe without being noticed, how to listen more than he spoke, and how to endure long stretches of silence. At some point, war intersected with his path, either through forced service, attachment to a military unit, or proximity to armed conflict, exposing him to weapons, drills, and the discipline of survival under fire. Accounts suggest he possessed an uncommon familiarity with rifles, not just in firing them but in maintaining, modifying, and using them in difficult terrain. He understood wind, distance, elevation, and timing, knowledge that usually came from extended exposure rather than brief instruction. Whether this training was formal or learned through imitation and necessity remains unclear, but it set him apart from the men sent to capture him, many of whom relied on intimidation rather than precision. His relationship with the land was equally critical. He moved through forests and hills as someone who knew which ground swallowed sound and which carried it, which paths erased footprints and which betrayed them. Seasonal changes mattered to him, as did weather patterns, animal behavior, and the habits of people who traveled the same routes repeatedly. This awareness transformed the environment into a kind of armor, concealing his movements while exposing those who followed. Despite later depictions that cast him as a solitary phantom, he was not entirely cut off from human connection. There were those who fed him, warned him, or simply looked away when he passed. These moments of quiet assistance were acts of defiance in themselves, born from shared fear or shared resentment toward the hunters. Trust was rare and temporary, but it existed long enough to keep him moving and informed. What distinguished him most was not aggression, but restraint. He did not seek confrontation for its own sake, nor did he strike blindly. Each action appeared deliberate, measured against risk and consequence. He understood that every shot revealed something about his position, his weapon, and his intent. This discipline suggested a mind trained to think beyond immediate survival, anticipating responses and adapting before his pursuers realized they were being studied. As the bounty grew and stories spread, the man began to exist in two forms at once: the physical individual navigating hunger, exhaustion, and injury, and the figure imagined by those hunting him, inflated by rumor and fear. This dual existence made him harder to capture, as the hunters chased not just a man but an idea, one shaped by their own anxieties and assumptions, while the real person continued to move quietly through spaces they believed they controlled. The men who accepted the bounty began with a set of assumptions that shaped every decision they made. They believed the target would behave like others before him, moving recklessly, driven by fear, and ultimately making mistakes under pressure. Experience had taught them that most people on the run were exhausted, hungry, and isolated, their resistance broken long before capture. This belief allowed the hunters to approach the task with confidence rather than caution. They saw the man as alone without the visible protection of a group or an armed escort, and interpreted this isolation as weakness. In their world, power came from numbers, from noise, and from the visible display of weapons. Someone who moved quietly and avoided attention was assumed to be hiding rather than planning. The hunters mistook absence for helplessness and silence for surrender. The bounty itself reinforced this misjudgment. Notices framed the target as property that had fled, rather than as an individual with experience or capability. Language reduced him to physical description and monetary value, erasing any hint of skill or intelligence. By the time the hunters set out, they were chasing a symbol rather than a person, expecting a transaction rather than a confrontation. Their previous successes encouraged complacency. Many had built reputations by overwhelming their targets quickly, relying on intimidation and surprise rather than strategy. They were accustomed to resistance collapsing under the threat of violence, and when it did not, they responded with greater force rather than reflection. This pattern left little room for the idea that a hunted man might be capable of reversing the roles. The landscape further distorted their judgment. They believed familiarity with roads, towns, and informants gave them control over the region. Maps and local contacts created the illusion of dominance, While the deeper wilderness was dismissed as a temporary obstacle rather than a decisive factor, the hunters expected the terrain to slow the target, not themselves. Their confidence was also rooted in the law, which had protected them repeatedly from consequence. They carried papers, warrants, and the assurance that any violence they inflicted would be justified after the fact. This sense of legal immunity bred recklessness, making them less attentive to signs of danger and less willing to question their own vulnerability. By the time they entered the forests and hills where the man had chosen to move, their expectations were fixed. They believed they were closing in on a cornered fugitive whose options were narrowing with every step. The idea that he might be watching, measuring, and preparing never fully took hold, because acknowledging that possibility would have required them to confront the fragility of the power they thought they held. The moment violence began did not announce itself with shouting or a visible charge, but with an abrupt absence of sound where it should have existed. The hunters were moving through familiar patterns, boots pressing into leaf litter, weapons carried with casual readiness, conversation drifting in low tones that assumed safety. Then one of them collapsed, not dramatically, but as if the ground had simply given way beneath him. There was no immediate understanding of what had happened. No muzzle flash was seen, no direction obvious. The body lay still, eyes open, expression unchanged, and for a brief second the others assumed accident or illness. It was only when blood began to darken the soil that realization set in, followed closely by confusion. They had entered a space where cause and effect were no longer visible. Instinct drove them to search for the shooter, but instinct had been shaped by open fights and visible enemies. Rifles were raised, men shouted, and eyes scanned tree lines that revealed nothing. The forest absorbed their noise and returned silence, a silence that felt deliberate rather than empty. Each second stretched longer than the last as the hunters struggled to locate a threat that refused to present itself. Panic crept in unevenly, settling into different men in different ways. Some froze, unable to decide whether to run or stand their ground. Others moved erratically, circling, backtracking, calling out names that received no answer. The assumption that violence would come face to face was shattered, replaced by the realization that it could arrive from anywhere, at any time, without warning. The second shot, when it came, did not follow immediately. It waited. This delay was more unsettling than speed because it suggested intention. The man they hunted was not firing blindly or in desperation, but choosing his moments, allowing fear to build and mistakes to form. By the time another hunter fell, the group understood that each sound they made could draw death closer. Attempts to regroup only made them more visible. Clusters of movement, raised voices, and hurried gestures created patterns that could be read from a distance. The hunters began to grasp that their own habits were being used against them, that someone was anticipating where they would look and how they would react. Control of the encounter had shifted, though few were ready to admit it. What had been expected to unfold as a straightforward capture now resembled an unraveling. Confidence drained away with every unanswered question and every minute spent exposed to an unseen presence. The forest no longer felt neutral, but complicit, a place that concealed the man who had fired the first shot while offering no protection to those who had come to claim him. The man understood the forest as more than just a backdrop. It was a living instrument, and he moved through it as a conductor moves through a symphony. Every ridge, ravine, and cluster of trees became part of a strategy, not merely scenery. He observed how the wind carried sound, how shadows shifted with the angle of the sun, and how the cries of animals could mask or reveal human movement, turning nature itself into a weapon. Footpaths that seemed ordinary to the hunters were chosen deliberately to obscure tracks, leading into areas where the ground swallowed footprints and animal trails could confuse trackers. Streams and gullies became natural barriers that slowed pursuit, but he knew them as shortcuts that could be crossed silently. Rocks and fallen logs offered vantage points unseen from the paths, allowing him to survey without being surveyed, to plan each movement with precision that his pursuers could not anticipate. Timing was essential. He knew when the fog would roll in, softening sound and concealing motion, and when the sun would hit a particular slope, blinding those who attempted to follow. Each day presented a new pattern to exploit, and he adapted constantly, never relying on repetition. Hunters expected predictability, and by remaining fluid, he made their assumptions useless, forcing them into reactive, panicked decisions. The wildlife itself was an ally, whether intentionally or by circumstance. Bird calls, snapping twigs, or rustling leaves could be interpreted as the approach of men, but he used them to misdirect, to create the illusion of presence or absence. He understood which sounds would alert the hunters and which would pass unnoticed. This mastery of environmental signals allowed him to manipulate perception, turning the forest into a hall of mirrors where reality and fear intertwined. At night, the forest became a different battlefield. Darkness altered perception, and small movements were amplified by imagination. He traveled in ways that avoided moonlight, used natural cover to obscure his silhouette, and anticipated where hunters would set camp. Fires, usually a lure or signal for travelers, were approached cautiously, analyzed for patterns, and avoided when they could reveal position. The night offered danger, but also opportunity, a duality he learned to navigate with instinct refined by experience. Even when hunters thought they were closing in, the terrain worked against them. Steep inclines exhausted pursuers more quickly than the man, who had conditioned himself to move lightly, efficiently, and without sound. He knew where the land funneled movement and where it provided escape. Their reliance on linear tracking and conventional paths was exploited at every turn, creating an invisible labyrinth in which the hunters themselves became lost. Every encounter reinforced the notion that he was not merely surviving but controlling the environment. His knowledge transformed the forest from a passive backdrop into an active participant in the hunt. Each step, pause, and observation was part of a deliberate rhythm that kept him ahead. The hunter's confidence eroded with each misstep, each fruitless search, each false signal, while the man remained unseen, moving through a world that was not merely familiar, but intimately his own. Fear became the most powerful weapon the man wielded, and it spread not through direct confrontation but through the invisible pressure of uncertainty. Each hunter experienced it differently, a creeping dread that began with small, inexplicable occurrences and grew into full-blown panic. Footsteps that sounded behind them vanished when they turned. Shadows seemed to flicker just beyond vision, and the wind carried whispers that could have been words. The forest itself became an accomplice, amplifying anxiety, creating a tension that no amount of bravado could dissipate. As the hunters struggled to maintain cohesion, mistrust grew between them. Every misstep was scrutinized, every pause interpreted as weakness or betrayal. Some questioned whether a companion had acted recklessly, revealing their position. Others feared being singled out, the first to fall in an unseen ambush. This division weakened them more effectively than any rifle shot, as cohesion and confidence had been their greatest assets before the encounter began. Survivors later described sensations that were almost physical in intensity. Hearts pounded in anticipation of movement that never came, hands clenched in reflex, muscles tensed and released with the unpredictability of each step. Sleep became impossible, even in the relative safety of camp, as the possibility of observation persisted. The hunter's world, once governed by control and authority, had been inverted. They were now prey in a terrain they assumed they dominated. Rumors and exaggerated accounts fueled fear as well. When one man disappeared, others speculated wildly about what had occurred. Imaginations filled in gaps that reality had left empty, making the ghostly presence larger than it was, a phantom capable of impossible feats. Each account reinforced the notion that they were being hunted by someone not bound by the limitations of ordinary men, someone who could strike with impunity and vanish without trace. The hunter's reliance on tools and routine became liabilities. Firearms, normally instruments of security, were now sources of sound and exposure, and every raised voice or shouted command could betray location. Campfires, once sources of warmth and reassurance, became lures for an unseen observer. Even simple movement through the underbrush carried consequences, as the man anticipated, manipulated, and exploited the predictable patterns of fear that governed their behavior. Gradually, hesitation replaced initiative. The men began to second-guess every choice, aware that a single misstep could be fatal. Decisions that once seemed straightforward, where to walk, when to call, which path to follow, became fraught with danger. Fear warped perception, exaggerating distances, shadows, and the presence of movement. By the time they recognized the skill behind their adversary's strategy, much of their confidence had already eroded, leaving only anxiety and instinct. With each passing hour, the psychological toll accumulated. Bodies might have remained untouched, but the mind was under constant assault. Exhaustion, stress, and hypervigilance intertwined, creating a state where judgment faltered and panic guided actions. In this way, the man exerted power without firing a single shot, shaping outcomes through manipulation of perception, environment, and expectation, until the hunters were no longer in command of themselves or the terrain they sought to dominate. By the time the legend of the ghost sniper began to spread, it had taken on a life of its own, separating from the reality of the man himself. Hunters spoke of him in hushed tones, each retelling adding feats that may never have occurred but that served to amplify fear. In local taverns and along dirt roads, whispers described a figure who appeared and disappeared at will, a presence that could strike without warning and vanish as if swallowed by the earth itself. What began as a person became a symbol, a phantom shaped by the anxieties and imaginations of those who feared him most. Communities quickly absorbed the stories, altering them with each retelling to suit their own experiences and fears. Some spoke of lights flickering where no campfire should have been, or of rifles discharging in the distance without visible shooters. Others described shadows moving in impossible patterns, figures glimpsed at dawn or dusk that could not be approached. Each account reinforced the idea that the man was more than human, a spirit of vengeance rather than a man in flesh and blood. The boundaries between fact and myth blurred, making it impossible to separate what had actually happened from what had been imagined. The hunters themselves contributed to the growth of the legend, even as they tried to suppress it. Survivors returned to towns and recounted events in ways that emphasized terror and unpredictability, partly as a way to rationalize their own failures. Every missed shot, every moment of confusion, became evidence of a supernatural skill, and the story evolved beyond what the man could have intended or imagined. By the time the events had traveled through even a few retellings, the ghost sniper existed in the minds of many as an almost elemental force, an idea more terrifying than reality could ever be. Local populations also had their own reasons for nurturing the legend. Stories of a lone figure striking back at slave hunters offered a sense of justice, a whisper of hope in a world governed by oppression and fear. The man became a symbol of resistance, an embodiment of the possibility that even the most powerful enforcers of the law could be challenged. Even those who had never seen him learned to respect his presence, to alter their own movements and behavior in accordance with the myth, demonstrating how fear and reputation can become as effective as weapons in shaping the world. The duality of the man's existence, both real and imagined, also protected him. Hunters who approached cautiously, uncertain whether they faced a phantom or a man, were more likely to make mistakes. The uncertainty created hesitation, and hesitation created opportunity. The legend worked as a form of psychological camouflage, magnifying his capabilities in the minds of pursuers while allowing him to continue moving unseen. Each encounter reinforced the perception that he was unpredictable and omnipresent, a shadow that could not be trapped. Even written records contributed to the mystique, though unintentionally. Sparse mentions in newspapers, diaries, and military reports often framed him as elusive or skilled, without providing details that could confirm identity. These fragmented records left gaps that rumor eagerly filled, producing a narrative that was part history and part folklore. Over time, stories combined, evolved, and grew in scale, creating a larger-than-life persona that dominated local memory long after the specific details of individual encounters had faded. Ultimately, the ghost sniper became a cautionary tale as well as a legend. He existed not only in the reality of the forests and trails he traversed, but in the collective imagination of those who feared him. The narrative of his elusiveness and precision transcended personal experience, entering into the cultural memory of the region. In this way, the man continued to influence behavior, alter movements, and inspire stories, becoming a presence that shaped the world around him as much through myth as through action. After the war ended, the fate of the ghost sniper remained uncertain, swallowed by the chaos and displacement that followed the conflict. Some claimed he had crossed rivers and mountains to reach freedom in the north, blending into towns where no one would question a quiet man passing through. Others believed he had returned to the woods, living off the land until time and exhaustion finally caught up with him, leaving behind nothing but the echo of his presence. Each version reflected the impossibility of knowing his true path, as if the forests themselves had chosen to guard his secrets. Those who had hunted him carried the memory of failure for the rest of their lives, haunted not just by what he had done, but by what they imagined he might have done. The terror he instilled persisted in dreams and conversations, shaping how they moved, where they went, and the stories they told. Some claimed to see him in fleeting glimpses decades later, a figure disappearing at the edge of vision, always moving just beyond reach. His existence had become a lesson in humility, a reminder that skill, patience, and knowledge could overturn brute force and assumed authority. Communities preserved fragments of his story, passing them down from parent to child, often with alterations and embellishments that suited the fears or moral lessons of the teller. In rural settlements, taverns, and along old trails, the ghost sniper was remembered not as a person, but as a force, a manifestation of resistance and cunning that could not be fully explained. The lines between fact and legend blurred further with each retelling, so that the man himself became almost irrelevant compared to the aura he left behind. Memory transformed him into a symbol that carried meaning beyond the immediate events of his life. Historical records, when they exist, are sparse and contradictory. Letters, diaries, and government documents offer only brief, fragmentary references that hint at his existence without confirming details. The lack of clarity has invited speculation, leading historians and storytellers alike to fill gaps with inference, conjecture, and imagination. Even those who attempt rigorous research find themselves reconstructing not a life, but an idea, a man whose legend has become inseparable from the events he shaped through action and the fear he inspired through myth. His impact extended beyond the hunters he evaded. For those living under the shadow of bounty and pursuit, the story served as proof that resistance was possible, that knowledge, skill, and awareness of the environment could tilt the balance against overwhelming odds. The ghost sniper became a touchstone for survival, strategy, and ingenuity, inspiring caution, respect, and sometimes admiration. In a world where law, violence, and power were assumed to be absolute, he proved that a single individual could unsettle the system, leaving traces in memory far longer than in records. Generations later, the figure of the ghost sniper persisted as a cautionary narrative, a way to explain encounters with danger, the limits of control, and the consequences of underestimating an opponent. Stories told around fires and in rural gatherings emphasize the lessons of vigilance, patience, and respect for skill. In some accounts, he is almost supernatural, a phantom presence that cannot be pinned down, while in others he is human, flawed and mortal, but unmatched in his ability to navigate the environment and manipulate perception. Both versions serve the same purpose, to ensure that the story continues. Even as the war faded from living memory, the ghost sniper remained, a testament to the power of individual action and the persistence of legend. Hunters, civilians, and communities all contributed to his myth, each retelling reinforcing the duality of the man who was both real and imagined. His existence became a lens through which people examined fear, strategy, and morality, and through which history itself could be interrogated, revealing the tension between recorded fact and lived experience. In this way, he outlasted the conflict itself, shaping memory and story in ways that neither time nor circumstance could erase.